Behind the polite smiles of the British entertainment elite from the swinging 60s to the decadent 90s lay a shadowy world. When the studio lights went dark, their exclusive private gatherings transformed into uninhibited midnight celebrations of pure, unbridled hedonism. We are pulling back the curtain on the most scandalous, wildly unpredictable nocturnal secrets of your favorite icons. Which of these hidden histories shocks you the most? Tell us in the comments below, and please subscribe to our channel for more dark mysteries of the glittering elite. Oliver Reed, the quintessential British tough guy of the silver screen, was perhaps even more notorious for his off-screen escapades than his formidable acting talent. Throughout the vibrant decades of the 1960s and 1970s, his grand country estate became the ultimate sanctuary for extreme celebrations. Guests would arrive expecting a traditional dinner party, only to find themselves swept up in a chaotic whirlwind of endless libations and wildly uninhibited nocturnal adventures. The brooding actor thoroughly despised the stifling rules of polite high society, preferring a primal environment where his illustrious guests could truly shed their inhibitions. It was an open secret in the cinematic industry that an invitation to his sprawling mansion meant surrendering to a marathon of physical endurance and unbridled passion. Reports from those dizzying nights speak of completely unrestrained revelry that lasted for many days on end, blurring the lines of waking reality. Behind heavily locked doors, the polite constraints of traditional British modesty were entirely discarded by the glittering elite. The host himself would often orchestrate bizarre midnight challenges, pushing his famous friends to their absolute limits in a dizzying display of bravado. The atmosphere was incredibly intoxicating, drawing in the biggest names of the British film industry who were desperately seeking an escape from their carefully curated, immaculately clean public images. Many who attended these legendary gatherings whispered about the sheer scale of the intimate indulgence, where every conceivable worldly pleasure was made readily available. The sprawling grounds of his Gothic mansion provided the perfect secluded backdrop for midnight activities that would have undoubtedly ruined prominent careers had they been caught on camera. It was a shadowy world entirely disconnected from the mundane realities of everyday existence and traditional moral constraints. In this secretive hedonistic bubble, the rich and famous could completely lose themselves without any fear of public judgment. His gatherings were not merely simple weekend parties, they were legendary, uninhibited rites of passage for the true bohemian elite of that transformative era. Despite the shocking whispers that frequently circulated the private clubs of London, the sheer animalistic magnetism of the host kept the exclusive guest lists completely full all year round. Prominent figures were helplessly drawn to the danger and the promise of experiencing something genuinely extraordinary. Even as the toll of such a ferocious lifestyle began to show in his later years, the dark legend of his clandestine nights only grew much stronger. He created a lasting legacy of nocturnal rebellion that permanently cemented his status as the undisputed king of the British underground entertainment scene. Richard Burton, a voice of absolute gravel and a presence that could command any grand theatre, this Welsh acting titan was equally commanding when the stage lights went down. During the height of his massive global fame in the 1960s and the 1970s, his private suites in the most luxurious hotels across Europe transformed into epicenters of wild, untamed passion. He surrounded himself with a fiercely loyal entourage of beautiful companions who were more than willing to partake in the incredible, dizzying excesses that accompanied his cinematic success and wealth. The heavily whispered stories of his private midnight gatherings are deeply steeped in a kind of tragic, intoxicating glamour, where the endless flowing of the finest vintage beverages was only the very beginning of the evening entertainment. Behind locked mahogany doors, the polite constraints of British modesty were entirely discarded, rapidly replaced by an atmosphere of intense, almost feverish physical indulgence. It was widely known amongst elite aristocratic circles that crossing the threshold into his personal domain meant entering a secretive realm where moral boundaries ceased to exist. He was a deeply complicated man, driven by profound internal complexities, and his chosen method of escape was to surround himself with a total sensory overload of stunning guests and relentless, uninhibited celebration. The secretive gatherings were famously passionate, frequently escalating into highly liberated physical scenarios that genuinely shocked even the most hardened veterans of the global entertainment industry. The sheer volume of unrestrained romantic entanglements and entirely unbridled nocturnal activities became a heavily guarded legend across the exclusive clubs of London. Fellow acclaimed actors, prominent socialites, and glittering musicians would receive extremely discreet, last-minute invitations to his sprawling rented villas or lavish metropolitan penthouses. Once successfully inside the heavily guarded premises, they found themselves completely immersed in a surreal, intoxicating landscape of absolute indulgence, where multiple intimate encounters unfolded simultaneously without a single shred of guilt or hesitation. It was a fiercely protected modern feast of the senses, beautifully tailored for the elite members of the cinematic aristocracy of that era. Despite his incredibly famous marriages and highly publicized dramatic romances, these shadowy, intimate events remained fiercely protected by a loyal, tightly knit inner circle of trusted confidants. The chosen guests inherently understood the strict, unwritten rule of absolute silence regarding the incredibly passionate affairs that took place far away from the prying, intrusive lenses of the tabloid paparazzi. The host demanded total, unwavering submission to the evening trajectory, encouraging everyone present to completely abandon their carefully constructed, immaculate public personas. Peter Sellers, the comedic genius of the 1960s and 1970s, hid a profoundly restless spirit behind his countless cinematic masks. While international audiences roared with laughter at his iconic, wonderfully clumsy characters, his private reality was remarkably different and intensely secretive. His luxurious London residences and lavish country homes routinely transformed into heavily guarded sanctuaries for deeply passionate, wildly uninhibited midnight celebrations. The fiercely unpredictable star desperately sought constant physical distraction from his overwhelming inner complexities. He famously surrounded himself with a dazzling array of stunning international models and prominent British socialites who were incredibly eager to experience the glittering pinnacle of the elite underground. Invitations to his highly exclusive weekend retreats were desperately coveted by those craving a true taste of absolute, unrestricted nocturnal indulgence. Once the heavy velvet curtains were drawn tightly shut and the vintage beverages began to flow endlessly, the polite rules of traditional society were instantly completely forgotten. The atmosphere within these opulent, dimly lit rooms was deeply intoxicating, frequently evolving into highly liberated physical scenarios that firmly defied the rigid expectations of the era. Guests willingly surrendered to a mesmerizing environment where multiple intimate romantic encounters boldly unfolded. Observers from his fiercely loyal inner circle occasionally whispered about the sheer theatricality of these deeply unrestrained evening affairs. The eccentric host would frequently orchestrate elaborate, sensory-rich environments, carefully utilizing dramatic lighting and exotic music to completely lower the inhibitions of his incredibly glamorous attendees. It was a fiercely guarded nocturnal playground where the glittering cinematic aristocracy could explore their deepest hidden desires. Despite his incredibly fragile health and a steady string of highly publicized, deeply turbulent marriages, his fervent appetite for these wildly passionate gatherings never truly diminished. He seemingly treated these secretive events as a completely necessary escape mechanism, a beautifully chaotic bubble where the immense pressures of global fame simply melted away into the dark shadows. The sheer volume of beautiful companions rotating through his lavish estates remained a protected secret. The dark, legendary tales of his deeply uninhibited private life completely contrasted with the beloved, innocent characters he immortalized on the grand silver screen. Those incredibly fortunate enough to cross the threshold into his secretive domain witnessed a man entirely consumed by a relentless pursuit of ultimate physical pleasure and endless sensory overload. His clandestine legacy remains an utterly fascinating, deeply dramatic testament to the wildly hidden excesses of that era. Peter O'Toole. Behind the piercing azure eyes and the towering aristocratic elegance of this cinematic giant burned a ferocious appetite for nocturnal rebellion. While audiences across the globe were mesmerized by his masterful dramatic performances, his private reality during the 1960s and 1970s was entirely different. His lavish metropolitan residences frequently served as the ultimate concealed sanctuaries for the most incredibly wild, uninhibited celebrations the British capital had ever witnessed. Unlike his famously brooding contemporaries, He possessed a wildly theatrical, almost poetic approach to his deeply secretive evening escapades. A seemingly innocent invitation to a sophisticated gathering would rapidly descend into a dizzying vortex of absolute sensory indulgence. The polite conventions of traditional society were enthusiastically abandoned, rapidly replaced by an intoxicating atmosphere where deeply passionate physical encounters boldly unfolded in every shadowed corner of the grand estate. The sheer scale of these deeply liberated multi-day gatherings was absolutely staggering, drawing in a dazzling procession of international beauties, bohemian artists, and immensely wealthy socialites. Once, the heavy oak doors were firmly bolted shut against the prying eyes of the London paparazzi. The charismatic host dismantled all remaining moral boundaries. It was a fiercely guarded environment where multiple intimate romantic entanglements were actively encouraged by the mesmerizing master of the house. He possessed a deeply magnetic, almost hypnotic ability to persuade his famous guests to completely shed their carefully constructed public inhibitions. The endless flowing of the finest vintage beverages acted as a potent catalyst, transforming respected members of the traditional British establishment into willing participants in his wildly theatrical, unrestrained midnight rituals. The sprawling rooms of his elegant estates echoed with the sounds of pure, unbridled pleasure and magnificent celebration until dawn. Those fortunate enough to successfully penetrate his fiercely loyal inner circle frequently spoke of a surreal, deeply intoxicating wonderland entirely detached from mundane reality. He viewed these passionate, highly secretive gatherings as a vital, necessary rebellion against the suffocating expectations of global cinematic stardom. The profound physical indulgence provided a deeply chaotic but essential emotional release, allowing him to escape the immense weight of his own highly celebrated theatrical genius. Despite the heavily whispered rumors that continuously circulated within the exclusive private clubs of the entertainment industry, the total loyalty of his devoted companions kept the most shocking details entirely hidden. He masterfully cultivated an extraordinary legacy of intellectual brilliance permanently intertwined with a deeply unashamed, relentless pursuit of ultimate physical gratification. His secretive nocturnal empire remains a magnificent, dramatic testament to the truly wild, uninhibited era of the classic British screen. Richard Harris. A towering figure of immense theatrical brilliance and poetic soul, this legendary actor was equally famous for a personal life that resembled a beautifully chaotic, endlessly roaring tempest. Throughout the vibrant decades of the 1960s and the 1970s, his grand residences in the heart of London served as the ultimate backdrop for some of the most scandalous, heavily guarded celebrations of the era. While he captivated international audiences with his deep, brooding on-screen intensity, his private nights were entirely dedicated to the absolute pursuit of unrestricted, dizzying pleasure. The charismatic star possessed a deeply complex, fiercely restless spirit that constantly demanded profound sensory distraction from the immense pressures of his cinematic stardom. A casual evening invitation to his sprawling, luxurious home would inevitably transform into a sprawling, multi-day marathon of completely uninhibited physical indulgence and endless flowing of vintage beverages. The polite, rigid constraints of traditional high society were enthusiastically left at the front door, rapidly replaced by a deeply intoxicating atmosphere where absolutely no worldly pleasure was denied to his chosen guests. Behind heavily locked mahogany doors, the atmosphere within his opulent, dimly lit reception rooms was intensely charged with a ferocious, almost primal romantic energy. It was widely whispered amongst the fiercely loyal inner circles of the British entertainment industry that his secretive midnight gatherings frequently escalated into highly liberated physical scenarios. Guests willingly surrendered to a mesmerizing, theatrical environment where multiple intimate encounters boldly unfolded in every shadowed corner of the grand estate, entirely free from any mundane moral judgment. The immensely charming host brilliantly orchestrated these deeply unrestrained evening affairs, attracting a dazzling procession of beautiful international models, bohemian artists, and incredibly wealthy socialites. Once successfully inside the fiercely protected premises, the glittering attendees found themselves completely immersed in a surreal landscape of absolute, unapologetic hedonism. He demanded total, unwavering submission to the wild trajectory of the evening, actively encouraging everyone present to completely abandon their carefully constructed, immaculate public personas for the sake of pure, unbridled celebration. Those incredibly fortunate enough to cross the threshold into his secretive domain witnessed a profoundly passionate man entirely consumed by a relentless pursuit of ultimate physical release. He seemingly treated these wildly chaotic, highly secretive events as a completely necessary escape mechanism, a magnificent bubble where the profound weight of his own celebrated artistic genius simply melted away into the dark shadows. The sheer volume of stunning companions rotating through his lavish metropolitan estates remained a heavily protected secret, guarded fiercely by his devoted entourage. Despite his incredibly famous, highly publicized dramatic romances and frequent clashes with the traditional establishment, his fervent appetite for these wildly passionate gatherings never truly diminished. The dark, legendary tales of his deeply uninhibited private nights perfectly contrasted with the brilliant, often tragic characters he immortalized on the grand silver screen. His clandestine nocturnal empire remains an utterly fascinating, deeply dramatic testament to the genuinely wild, uninhibited excesses of the classic British cinematic underground. Freddie Mercury. Far removed from the traditional stiff upper lip of the British establishment, this legendary musical icon redefined the very concept of modern decadence during the 1970s and 1980s. While his theatrical stage presence mesmerized massive global stadiums, his private metropolitan residences and heavily guarded hotel suites became the ultimate epicenters of the most astonishingly uninhibited, sensory-rich midnight gatherings the entertainment world had ever witnessed. A seemingly simple invitation to one of his legendary nocturnal celebrations was the ultimate golden ticket for the bohemian elite, promising an absolute departure from mundane earthly reality. Once the heavy oak doors were securely locked against the prying lenses of the relentless tabloid paparazzi, the traditional constraints of polite society completely evaporated. He meticulously curated environments where unbridled physical indulgence and endless vintage libations flowed freely until dawn. The sheer theatrical scale of his highly secretive evening affairs was genuinely breathtaking, frequently featuring dazzling arrays of exotic performers, prominent socialites, and beautiful companions. Behind heavily drawn curtains, the atmosphere was fiercely charged with a deeply romantic energy, actively encouraging his illustrious guests to entirely shed their public inhibitions. Multiple deeply intimate encounters boldly unfolded in every shadowy, opulent corner of the sprawling venues. As the immensely charismatic master of ceremonies, he demanded nothing less than total, unwavering submission to the beautifully chaotic trajectory of the evening. His sprawling estates transformed into magnificent, fiercely protected sanctuaries where the glittering aristocracy of the entertainment industry could explore their deepest clandestine desires without a single shred of moral judgment. It was a dizzying marathon of absolute pleasure, entirely disconnected from the restrictive outside world. Those incredibly fortunate enough to penetrate his fiercely loyal inner circle frequently whispered about the boundless, almost exhausting energy that continuously fueled these wildly passionate, highly liberated events. He seemingly utilized these spectacularly unrestrained gatherings as a vital, necessary emotional escape from the immense pressures of his unprecedented global stardom. The profound physical release provided a beautifully chaotic bubble, allowing the complex performer to lose himself. Despite the heavily whispered, deeply shocking rumors that continuously circulated within the exclusive private clubs of London, the total loyalty of his devoted entourage kept the most scandalous details completely hidden. He masterfully cultivated an extraordinary, enduring legacy of unparalleled artistic brilliance permanently intertwined with a deeply unashamed pursuit of ultimate physical gratification. His secretive nocturnal empire remains a dramatic testament to that beautifully wild era. David Bowie. A chameleon of unparalleled artistic brilliance and ethereal grace, this musical and cinematic visionary spent the turbulent decades of the 1970s and 1980s completely redefining the boundaries of global pop culture. While audiences were continually mesmerized by his constantly shifting, otherworldly on-screen personas, his private metropolitan residences in London and Berlin frequently transformed into heavily guarded sanctuaries for the most incredibly wild, uninhibited celebrations. Behind the elegant, sharply tailored public image burned a deeply complex spirit that constantly demanded profound sensory exploration. The incredibly charismatic star brilliantly orchestrated deeply unrestrained evening affairs, attracting a dazzling, highly eclectic procession of international models, avant-garde artists, and incredibly wealthy bohemian socialites. A seemingly innocent invitation to his sprawling, dimly lit home would rapidly descend into a dizzying vortex of absolute physical indulgence and endless flowing of the finest vintage beverages. The polite, rigid constraints of traditional British high society were enthusiastically abandoned, rapidly replaced by an intoxicating atmosphere where completely unconventional romantic entanglements were openly encouraged. Once the heavy velvet curtains were securely drawn shut against the prying lenses of the relentless tabloid paparazzi, the traditional moral boundaries of the era completely evaporated. It was widely whispered amongst the fiercely loyal inner circles of the international entertainment industry that his secretive midnight gatherings frequently escalated into highly liberated physical scenarios. Guests willingly surrendered to a mesmerizing, theatrical environment where multiple intimate encounters boldly unfolded in every shadowed corner of the grand estate, entirely free from any mundane judgment or hesitation. The immensely charming host actively demanded total, unwavering submission to the wild, beautifully chaotic trajectory of the evening, encouraging everyone present to completely abandon their carefully constructed, immaculate public personas. Those incredibly fortunate enough to cross the threshold into his secretive domain witnessed a profoundly passionate visionary entirely consumed by a relentless pursuit of ultimate, unrestrained physical release. He seemingly treated these wildly chaotic, highly secretive events as a completely necessary emotional escape mechanism, a magnificent bubble where the profound weight of his own celebrated artistic genius simply melted away. Despite his incredibly famous, highly publicized dramatic artistic reinventions and frequent, intentional clashes with the traditional establishment, his fervent appetite for these wildly passionate gatherings never truly diminished during his peak years. The sheer volume of stunning, diverse companions rotating through his lavish metropolitan estates remained a heavily protected secret, guarded fiercely by his devoted, tight-knit entourage. The dark, legendary tales of his deeply uninhibited private nights perfectly contrasted with the brilliant, often aloof characters he immortalized on the grand silver screen and global stages. His clandestine nocturnal empire remains an utterly fascinating, deeply dramatic testament to the genuinely wild, uninhibited excesses of the classic British artistic underground. He masterfully cultivated an extraordinary, enduring legacy of unparalleled intellectual brilliance permanently intertwined with a deeply unashamed, relentless pursuit of ultimate physical gratification. The profoundly secretive, multi-day celebrations he hosted firmly cemented his status as a true, unapologetic pioneer of modern, unrestrained bohemian decadence. Mick Jagger, the undisputed frontman of the most dangerous musical ensemble in the world, cultivated a public image of pure, untamed rebellion. Yet, during the tumultuous decades of the 1960s and the 1970s, his private country estates and rented European villas became the epicenters for gatherings that far exceeded his staggering public notoriety. He possessed a deeply magnetic, almost dangerous charisma that drew the glittering global aristocracy into his secluded, shadowy world of ultimate nocturnal indulgence. An invitation to his sprawling, heavily guarded properties was considered the absolute pinnacle of social achievement for the bohemian elite of that transformative era. However, once the massive iron gates closed firmly behind the arriving guests, the polite conventions of traditional British society were instantly eradicated. He masterfully curated an atmosphere of intense sensory overload, where the endless flowing of vintage beverages was merely the prologue to a marathon of completely unrestrained physical liberation. The sprawling, dimly lit corridors of his opulent mansions frequently echoed with the sounds of pure, unbridled celebration until the early hours of the morning. It was a strict, unwritten rule amongst the illustrious attendees that these exclusive evening affairs were perfectly designed to dismantle every single moral boundary. The immensely charismatic host actively encouraged his beautiful, highly eclectic guests to completely surrender to the intoxicating energy of the completely uninhibited, theatrical environment. Whispers from his fiercely loyal inner circle frequently described a mesmerizing landscape where deeply passionate, multiple intimate encounters boldly unfolded in every opulent corner of the grand estates. He effortlessly commanded the wild trajectory of these beautifully chaotic nights, seamlessly blending international fashion models, prominent artists, and wealthy socialites into a dizzying vortex of absolute physical pleasure. The sheer scale of the unrestrained romantic entanglements was genuinely staggering. He seemingly viewed these wildly passionate, highly secretive events as a completely necessary rebellion against the immense, suffocating pressures of his unprecedented global fame and relentless touring schedule. The profound physical release provided a vital emotional escape, a beautifully chaotic bubble where the traditional rules of the mundane outside world simply did not apply. Despite the relentless, highly intrusive scrutiny of the paparazzi, the complete loyalty of his entourage kept the most shocking details entirely hidden. His deeply clandestine nocturnal empire remains an utterly fascinating, deeply dramatic testament to the genuinely wild, uninhibited excesses of the classic British artistic underground. He masterfully cultivated an extraordinary, enduring legacy of unparalleled musical brilliance, permanently intertwined with a deeply unashamed, relentless pursuit of ultimate physical gratification. The profoundly secretive, multi-day celebrations he hosted firmly cemented his undisputed status as a true pioneer of unrestrained modern decadence. Keith Moon, a chaotic force of nature behind the drum kit, this uniquely talented British musician was completely unparalleled in his capacity for sheer, unadulterated madness when the stage lights finally went dark. Throughout the explosive decades of the 1960s and 1970s, his luxurious rented mansions and sprawling country estates became synonymous with the absolute pinnacle of unhinged, deeply unpredictable nocturnal gatherings. While audiences worldwide marveled at his ferocious musical energy, his private reality was a terrifyingly wild, heavily guarded sanctuary for extreme sensory indulgence. The incredibly restless, fiercely impulsive star constantly demanded profound physical distraction from the immense, suffocating pressures of his unprecedented global fame. A seemingly casual evening invitation to his lavish, brightly lit home would instantaneously transform into a sprawling, multi-day marathon of completely unhinged physical destruction, endless flowing of vintage beverages, and wildly uninhibited celebrations. The polite, rigid constraints of traditional high society were violently shattered, rapidly replaced by a deeply intoxicating atmosphere where absolutely no worldly pleasure or absurd impulse was denied to his chosen, bewildered guests. Behind heavily locked oak doors, the atmosphere within his opulent reception rooms was intensely charged with a ferocious, almost primal, dangerous energy that actively encouraged everyone present to completely abandon their carefully constructed, immaculate public personas. It was widely whispered amongst the fiercely loyal inner circles of the British entertainment industry that his secretive midnight gatherings frequently escalated into highly liberated physical scenarios amidst the flying furniture and shattered glass. Guests willingly surrendered to a mesmerizing, theatrical environment where multiple intimate encounters boldly unfolded in every shadowed corner of the grand estate, entirely free from any mundane moral judgment or traditional boundaries. The immensely charming, highly erratic host brilliantly orchestrated these deeply unrestrained evening affairs, attracting a dazzling, deeply chaotic procession of beautiful international models, bohemian artists, and incredibly wealthy socialites who were drawn to the sheer danger of his orbit. Once successfully inside the fiercely protected premises, the glittering attendees found themselves completely immersed in a surreal, deafening landscape of absolute, unapologetic hedonism. He demanded total, unwavering submission to the wild, unpredictable trajectory of the evening, frequently orchestrating bizarre midnight challenges that pushed his famous friends to their absolute physical and mental limits in a dizzying display of bravado. Those incredibly fortunate enough to cross the threshold into his secretive domain witnessed a profoundly passionate, deeply troubled man entirely consumed by a relentless pursuit of ultimate physical release and endless sensory overload. He seemingly treated these wildly chaotic, highly secretive events as a completely necessary escape mechanism, a magnificent, explosive bubble where the profound weight of his own celebrated artistic genius simply melted away into the deafening noise. The sheer volume of stunning companions and bewildered musicians rotating through his lavish metropolitan estates remained a heavily protected secret, guarded fiercely by his devoted, exhausted entourage. Despite his incredibly famous, highly publicized dramatic public stunts and frequent catastrophic clashes with the traditional establishment, his fervent appetite for these wildly passionate gatherings never truly diminished until the very end. The dark, legendary tales of his deeply uninhibited private nights perfectly contrasted with the brilliant, often comical characters he projected to the global media. His clandestine nocturnal empire remains an utterly fascinating, deeply dramatic testament to the genuinely wild, uninhibited excesses of the classic British cinematic and musical underground, securing his dark legacy. Elton John. Beyond the glittering spectacles and feathered costumes of the global stage, this unparalleled musical maestro orchestrated private gatherings of unimaginable extravagance. During the dazzling heights of the 1970s and 1980s, his sprawling English country estates transformed into the ultimate sanctuaries for the most lavish, boundary-pushing nocturnal celebrations the entertainment industry had ever witnessed. The sheer scale of his immense hospitality was legendary, drawing a breathtakingly diverse crowd of cinematic royalty, international fashion icons, and bohemian artists. A highly coveted invitation to his secluded mansion promised an immediate departure from the mundane realities of the outside world. Once the heavy security gates closed firmly behind the limousines, the traditional constraints of polite British society completely dissolved into a mesmerizing wonderland of endless sensory indulgence. Within the opulent, heavily decorated corridors of his grand residences, the immensely charismatic host spared absolutely no expense in creating a dizzying theatrical atmosphere. The endless flowing of the most exclusive vintage beverages and the presence of completely uninhibited companions fueled a relentless marathon of physical liberation. It was a fiercely guarded environment where deeply passionate, multiple intimate encounters boldly unfolded far away from the prying lenses of the press. Whispers from his tightly knit inner circle frequently described a chaotic, beautiful landscape where the brightest stars of the era enthusiastically shed their carefully curated public personas. He brilliantly commanded the wild trajectory of these multi-day affairs, seamlessly blending spectacular entertainment with an atmosphere of absolute, unapologetic hedonism. The sheer volume of unrestrained romantic entanglements was genuinely staggering, leaving even the hardened veterans breathless. For the profoundly gifted but deeply complex performer, these wildly passionate, highly secretive events served as a completely necessary emotional escape from the suffocating pressures of his unprecedented global fame. The profound physical release and the surrounding whirlwind of unbridled celebration provided a vital, beautifully chaotic bubble where traditional rules simply did not apply. The complete loyalty of his devoted entourage kept the most shocking details entirely hidden in the shadows. His deeply clandestine nocturnal empire remains an utterly fascinating, highly dramatic testament to the genuinely wild, uninhibited excesses of the classic British artistic elite. He masterfully cultivated an extraordinary, enduring legacy of unparalleled musical brilliance permanently intertwined with a relentless pursuit of ultimate sensory gratification. Before embracing a quieter existence, the deeply secretive, lavish celebrations he hosted firmly cemented his status as a king of modern decadence,